Welcome to Mixed Magic Theater's We, They, and the People series. We, They, and the People is a Mixed Magic Theater civic engagement series that explores and dramatizes Supreme Court cases that have had a significant impact on the lives of all Americans, but especially its black citizens. The first case the project will review is the 2013 Shelby v. Holder ruling that overturned much of the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Bill that effectively opened the door for a wave of voter suppression efforts throughout the country. This project is supported by the XIX Shall Not Be Denied Why It Matters initiative of the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, part of the nationwide Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. This Theater at a Distance project is a donation-based streaming experience. All events are streamed on Mixed Magic Theater's YouTube channel. To subscribe to our YouTube channel and to support Mixed Magic Theater, please visit mmtri.org to make a donation. Thank you for your support, and as always, thank you for believing in magic.
The greatest right that a democratic government affords its citizens is the right to choose its governmental representatives in free and fair elections. A citizen's greatest duty to its country is to honor that sacred right by fulfilling the solemn responsibility of participation in government. Our ability to participate in this democratic republic has come with a heavy price for the nation's founders and by the ongoing struggle of Black Americans to gain and maintain the unfettered right to participate in government, that is, the right to vote. This country declared its independence from Great Britain in 1776 and fought a bloody war against former countrymen to secure its freedom. Of the 27 grievances enumerated in the new country's Declaration of Independence, the most remembered and enduring was the notion that citizens cannot and should not be governed without their express consent. The Boston Tea Party and the principle of no taxation without representation is a fundamental principle underlying our American notion of democratic rule and freedom. Free and slave, Black men fought in this war. The history of our democratic republic is steeped in the ultimate contradiction. The Revolutionary War of 1776 was fought to secure freedom from tyranny. However, the new country's aspiration to form a more perfect union exposed its ultimate contradiction, that a country which shed blood to escape tyranny practice its own form of tyranny by the existence of chattel slavery and the second-class citizenship of its women. It has been the mission and battleground of Black folk to right the hypocrisy of America's original sin. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. famously admonished, "All we say to America is, be true to what you said on paper." Since our emancipation over 150 years ago, we continue to admonish, be true to what you said on paper. If somehow by the passage of time Americans lost connection to the country's basic founding principles, Abraham Lincoln's address in Gettysburg made clear that in fighting the fight to maintain the Union, he pledged that our government shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Freedom and citizenship would take on a new dimension, never envisioned by our founding fathers when Lincoln issued his proclamation securing the freedom of diasporan Africans from chattel slavery in 1865. Not only did slaves and former slaves toil without recompense for over 200 years to help build the nation, they also laid down their lives to secure their own freedom in their adoptive country. Although the wars to establish independence from England and maintain a republic from slave-holding state secession have long since ended and its purposes secured, the fight by Black Americans to ascend to full citizenship has continued by voluntary participation in wars fought for their country and the ongoing fight to pass laws to secure and maintain this sacred right. The struggle for freedom has endured, as well as the racist and anti-democratic resistance to change by those committed to maintaining power and a white political majority. Although full citizenship was understood and afforded free men, the country has, over the course of our 245-year existence, slowly evolved to recognize the personhood and citizenship of women and former slaves and their descendants. Colonists gave their lives during this country's Revolutionary War to secure the most cherished of our rights, the right to vote. The Civil War was fought to preserve the Republic, as well as pave the way for citizenship for previously enslaved Black men and women. Free and slave, Black men and women fought this war. Following full emancipation of slaves by virtue of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, the Republican Party of Lincoln subsequently passed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, granting voting rights for all citizens, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Newly freed Black men would break from their shackles and have the opportunity for full participation in the country where they toiled for 200 years. Although Frances Ellen Watkins Harper would never enjoy the benefits about to be bestowed upon her male counterparts, in a speech to the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in 1866, she best expressed the sentiments, hopes, and warning to a nation that would enable Black enfranchisement. She said, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul." During the 12-year period of Reconstruction following the Civil War, Black men in the South experienced a period of unprecedented participation in government, voting, and holding political office in local, state, and federal government. However, the nation's original sin of white supremacy has proven to be an inextinguishable, pernicious flame that has continued to blaze on and has forced descendants of slaves to continue to engage in their own wars for freedom for the past 245 years. Survivors and sympathizers of the Confederacy established organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, and the White Brotherhood, among others, to engage in a systematic, brutal, and murderous reign of terror against newly freed Black citizens to discourage them from voting. As they regained power, Democratic Party state governments, which eventually came to dominate the South after 1877, employed all sorts of legal and extra-legal means, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, just to name a few, to systematically deny Black men access to the ballot. And throughout the history of the American colonies and the United States, Black men and women have given their lives in the pursuit of freedom. Post-Reconstruction domestic terrorism and disenfranchisement would persist almost unabated until the victories of the civil rights movement nearly 100 years later. Collectively described as Jim Crow laws and legalized segregation, all means of social, economic, political, and educational disenfranchisement directed against Blacks continued primarily throughout the South for nearly 100 years. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s set the stage for a sustained moral, ethical, and legal battleground to establish laws that would hold the nation accountable to the freedoms established by the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The civil rights movement was the most successful and sustained domestic nonviolent war of mass protests, civil disobedience, and legislative advocacy to secure for blacks and all Americans sweeping legal guarantees of non-discrimination, bookended by the brutal murder of teenager Emmett Till in 1955 and the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. This period brought about the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1950, 1960, 64, 65, and 68. Supreme Court decisions outlawing segregation, and also established federal enforcement agencies. In particular, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 altered the course of the previous 100 years of our nation's history. Spearheaded by the brutality of Bloody Sunday that horrified black and white Americans alike, black protesters attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in a nonviolent march from Selma to Montgomery to secure voting rights. Marchers, including the Representative John Lewis, who became that march's most iconic figure, were brutally beaten and trampled by horses in a successful attempt to halt the march. But protected by federal troops and guaranteed safe passage to Montgomery, the march continued weeks later. In addition to outlawing racial discrimination in voting, the 1965 Voting Rights Act also ordered that states with a history of discriminatory practices be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice before passage of any new voting rules changes. But as John Lewis admonished prior to his passing in 2020, the vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. Although the 1965 Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in 2006, a narrowly divided Supreme Court of the United States dealt a disastrous blow to the pre-clearance provision of the act. The notion of requiring discriminatory governments to demonstrate that new voting rights laws not have that effect was wiped away. The 2013 Shelby County versus Holder decision ushered in a new era of sweeping Republican-inspired acts of voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement. The tactics evolved, but the basic playbook reemerged. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion for the court. He naively held to a mistaken notion that somehow the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were no longer necessary because the conditions that necessitated the act had ceased to exist. Any objective person would agree that the underlying condition for discrimination based on race is racism. For Roberts, this reality was a condition of the past. In her dissenting opinion, Ruth Bader Ginsburg succinctly stated, "Throwing out preclearance, when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes, is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet." The spirit of the 400-year struggle for freedom and full citizenry for Black folk in America is never ending. It has been a long and arduous journey. We should be reminded that the forces of white supremacy are forever vigilant. As Black Americans have successfully negotiated the minefields of gerrymandering and voter suppression, we have remained true to our roots of social justice and political activism, expressed in nonviolent protests and amongst the serious business of exercising our rights. We also reserve the right to sing and to dance in the celebration of our freedoms. As the fight for equality and voting rights continues, will the nation do what they said on paper or receive the curse of it in its soul?
I will be reading Chief Justice John Roberts' majority opinion. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 employed extraordinary measures to address an extraordinary problem, using the strong medicine of applying heavy requirements on some states and not others to fight suppression of voting rights. At the same time, voting discrimination still exists. No one doubts that. The question is whether the Act's extraordinary measures, including its disparate treatment of the states, continue to satisfy constitutional requirements. As we put it a short time ago, the Act imposes current burdens and must be justified by current needs. The Voting Rights Act sharply departs from these basic principles. It suspends all changes to state election law, however innocuous, until they have been pre-cleared by federal authorities in Washington, D.C. States must beseech the federal government for permission to implement laws that they would otherwise have the right to enact and execute on their own, subject, of course, to any injunction in a Section 2 action. The Attorney General has 60 days to object to a pre-clearance request, longer if he requests more information. If a state seeks pre-clearance from a 3-judge court, the process can take years. And despite the tradition of equal sovereignty, the Act applies to only 9 states and several additional counties. While one state waits months or years and expends funds to implement a validly enacted law, its neighbor can typically put the same law into effect immediately through the normal legislative process. Even if a non-covered jurisdiction is sued, there are important differences between those proceedings and pre-clearance proceedings. The pre-clearance proceeding not only switches the burden of proof to the supplicant jurisdiction, but also applies substantive standards quite different from those governing the rest of the nation.
I'll be reading the dissenting opinion from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. With overwhelming support in both houses, Congress concluded that for 2 prime reasons, Section 5 should continue in force, unabated. First, continuance would facilitate completion of the impressive gains thus far made. And second, continuance would guard against backsliding. Those assessments were well within Congress's province to make and should elicit this court's unstinting approbation. In voting rights cases, the court should defer to Congress, which has been given sweeping powers under the Constitution, and especially in amendments passed after the Civil War to protect such rights. Applying different rules to different states is nothing so unusual, and the court should only ask if the methods used by Congress to address the problem are rational and not subject them to a tougher test.
But history did not end in 1965. By the time the Act was reauthorized in 2006, there had been 40 more years of it. In assessing the current need for a pre-clearance system that treats states differently from one another today, that history cannot be changed. During that time, largely because of the Voting Rights Act, voting tests were abolished. Disparities in voter registration and turnout due to race were erased, and African Americans attained political office in record numbers. And yet the coverage formula that Congress reauthorized in 2006 ignores these developments, keeping the focus on decades-old data relevant to decades-old problems rather than the current data reflecting current needs. The 15th Amendment commands that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race or color, and it gives Congress the power to enforce that command. The amendment is not designed to punish for the past. Its purpose is to ensure a better future.
Congress approached the 2006 reauthorization of the VRA with great care and seriousness. The same cannot be said of the court's opinion today. The stated purpose of the Civil War amendments was to arm Congress with the power and authority to protect all persons within the nation from violations of their rights by the states. In exercising that power, then, Congress may use, quote, all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted, end quote, to the constitutional ends declared by these amendments. So when Congress acts to enforce the right to vote free from racial discrimination, we ask not whether Congress has chosen the means most wise, but whether Congress has rationally selected means appropriate to a legitimate end. Quote, it is not for us to review the congressional resolution of the need for its chosen remedy. It is enough that we be able to perceive a basis upon which the Congress might resolve the conflict as it did, end quote. Until today, in considering the constitutionality of the VRA, the court has accorded Congress the full measure of respect its judgments in this domain should garner.
Our decision in no way affects the permanent nationwide ban on racial discrimination in voting found in Section 2. We issue no holding on Section 5 itself, only on the coverage formula. Congress may draft another formula based on current conditions. Such a formula is an initial prerequisite to a determination that exceptional conditions still exist, justifying an extraordinary departure from the traditional course of relations between the states and the federal government. Our country has changed. And while any racial discrimination in voting is too much, Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes to remedy that problem speaks to current conditions. Chief Justice John Roberts.
The court holds Section 4B invalid on the ground that it is, quote, irrational to base coverage on the use of voting tests 40 years ago when such tests have been illegal since that time, end quote. But the court disregards what Congress set about to do in enacting the VRA. That extraordinary legislation scarcely stopped at the particular tests and devices that happened to exist in 1965. The grand aim of the act is to secure to all in our polity equal citizenship stature, a voice in our democracy undiluted by race. As the record for the 2006 reauthorization makes abundantly clear, second-generation barriers to minority voting rights have emerged in the covered jurisdictions as attempted substitutes for the first-generation barriers that originally triggered pre-clearance in those jurisdictions. The sad irony of today's decision lies in its utter failure to grasp why the VRA has proven effective. The court appears to believe that the VRA's success in eliminating the specific devices exited in 1965 means that pre-clearance is no longer needed. With that belief and the argument derived from it, history repeats itself. Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Huh?
That was good, guys. Hello and welcome to the third portion of We, They, and the People, where we're discussing the 2013 decision by the Supreme Court to overturn a portion of the Voting Rights Act. For this portion of the program, we have a guest who will be talking about the impact of the 2013 decision. Our guest today is Abu Barker, a retirement options certified retirement coach and the founder of Sankofa Retirement Coaching. He holds an undergraduate degree in secondary education, a master's degree in human development and counseling, as well as an MBA. Prior to his career in higher education, Abu was a professional basketball player in Europe. He has over 35 years of experience in various positions and responsibilities as a higher education professional, most recently as the Executive Assistant to the President for Strategic Planning and Interim Associate Vice President for Community, Equity, and Diversity at the University of Rhode Island. Abu's experience at the University of Rhode Island is as much sought after as an independent coach, consultant, trainer, and broadcaster, includes workshop and group facilitation, strategic planning, organization development, and executive leadership consulting and coaching. Kingian nonviolent training and college basketball analysis and commentary on radio and television. Thank you, Abu, and welcome.
Always a pleasure.
Well, over the many years that we've known each other, we've had some pretty animated conversations about a variety of subjects. But the voting rights, overturning of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 and the subsequent fallout from that, leading up to and following the 2020 election, has had a profound impact on voter confidence and especially voter suppression in regards to the African American community. What do you think? Where are we today in terms of what that fallout has meant?
Well, I'll start with the phrase that you just used, which, voter confidence. And whatever you see depends on where you stand. Confidence in the elections, for people who have dealt with a history of voter suppression and disenfranchisement, those folks feel have a certain kind of feeling and confidence in the ability to be able to simply cast their vote. Whereby at this point in time, based upon many of the things that the former president said, some of the confidence that a lot of people have is not based on anything in reality. It's not based on truth, but rather the confidence or lack thereof that many Republican members of the GOP in various states have is that if they simply put their ideas out there to the majority of the American people, they don't stand a chance as far as national elections are concerned. So they have to turn themselves to these extraordinary measures to keep people away from the ballot.
So I have believed for a long time that voter confidence, the lack of voter confidence or the challenge to voter confidence began in the 2000 election when the Supreme Court elected George Bush over Al Gore by overturning stopping the Florida recount. And then 4 years later, the same thing happened in Ohio. It seemed to open the door for people to lose faith in the electoral process. What did that mean, do you think, for the African American community in particular? If the overall the whole country there's a lack of voter confidence, why should black people have any confidence in it when it has worked against us for so many years?
Well, that's a great question. And I don't necessarily think that a lot of black folks do have confidence in the system per se. There's a lot of reasons not to have confidence, because I think you can go out and ask any number of people today about whether or not they have any trust in the system and ask them why. I think they'll say that they know that there are people who are in power who will cheat and do just about anything that they can do to maintain that power. So the lack of confidence, certainly for members of the African American community, but also Native Americans and also Latinos in this country who would deal with voter suppression, is obviously because they know that folks in power will do just about anything that they can, set up any kind of laws, tests, whatever they might be, to keep people from the ballot box. It's very, very clear.
The 2013 decision overturning portions of the Voting Rights Act seemed to suggest that we were in a post-racial nation, that we had elected an African-American president, that there were black elected officials in many states now that there weren't before, and that everything was okay. But evidence seems to point to the fact that as soon as that decision was made, there were efforts being made to institute voter suppression actions, particularly in southern states, but states throughout the country. Do you think black people, for the most part, have been aware of what these efforts have been? And what do we need to do to educate ourselves to be better prepared to deal with them?
I think for the most part, people are aware, and if the 2020 election didn't instruct or educate most people in this country, it certainly should have, when even folks, for example, in Detroit, Michigan, were having their votes attacked, not because people voted illegally, which of course is the big lie that was perpetrated, but simply because they lived in areas where the majority of folks who went to the polls are black. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very clear. And once again, what you see depends on where you stand. If you happen to be a black person who is politically active and wants to get out and vote, participate in the electoral process, be a fully fledged citizen and do what our ancestors want us to do by virtue of their struggles.
Fought and died for.
Fought and died for. And we continue to be in that situation where that's happening today, except maybe on a different front. So we obviously recognize and know what the battleground is. What needs to happen, and certainly by virtue of folks like Stacey Abrams, of course, who is preeminent in terms of getting out the vote, educating folks, is letting people know that regardless of what barriers are placed in front of us, and the barriers that are being placed in front of us now are different from what was placed in front of us, say, in 1923, but they're barriers nonetheless, and we simply need to continue to educate ourselves about how to circumvent those barriers and exercise our right to vote.
You know, one of the things that happened in the 2016 election, it was almost a perfect storm of events that led up to the 2016 election in which Donald Trump was elected president. I believe some of it had to do with obviously the 2000 election, where the sacred nature of the vote was challenged. And then Barack Obama, a black man, in 2008 and 2012, was elected, which polarized the country in some ways, which I think opened the door for somebody like Donald Trump to become president, the polarization. But who took advantage of the polarization? Because one of the things that seemed to happen in 2016 was black people were convinced that their vote didn't matter, or that Hillary Clinton was going to automatically, it was a slam dunk, don't worry about it, don't even bother going to the poll. That's the kind of voter suppression that I don't know if we were prepared for as much. But then it seemed to have, the whole script got flipped in 2020 when Stacey Abrams, among others, was saying, not only must you vote, but you must make a plan to vote. And everything that they set out to do to suppress that vote failed. So now I'm sitting here with a stack of papers about recent efforts to suppress the vote. And what do we have to do to make black people and young people, and especially, and people of color, be aware of what efforts are being made to suppress their vote and what we can do to overcome that suppression?
Man, that is, it's going to be a tough road to hoe. There's no question about it. Continued education, letting people know exactly what the stakes are. Now, it just so happened that in 2020, By virtue of Trump's presidency, everybody recognized exactly what the stakes were. Here was a man who, without saying that he was a white supremacist himself, or a Proud Boy, or an Oath Keeper, or a Klan member, was saying, these are my people. So when you have somebody come out as strongly and forcefully and blatantly and openly as he has, this raises the level of education in our own community and awareness. And what you said happened in 2016, where all of a sudden perhaps we became overconfident.
Yeah.
There are not many times in history when black folks have been overconfident about the integrity of the system working in their favor. So let's just say that I think that people recognize the threat that existed. What happened on January 6th was a blatant, open demonstration of just how fragile a democracy is and the lengths that people will go to maintain power, suppress vote, and to destroy democracy if it's to their advantage. So whether or not this persists in the years to come in future elections, I think it can and I think it will, because I do believe that what we saw last summer with Black Lives Matter, with the thousands of people who marched and the thousands that did it globally, I believe that that movement will continue, and it will continue to manifest in folks saying, we're going to vote no matter what.
Well, you know, as a teacher, both of us are teachers at some level. I have often told my students that, you know, that black people have always been aware there's a bear behind the curtain, a bear that's looking to devour us. And we prep ourselves. We live our lives very often being prepared to deal with that bear. We know it's there. We accept that it's there. It was many people who didn't believe that the bear was there who got caught. Because when the curtain got pulled back, the question becomes, is this who we are? I mean, is the veneer being pulled back on this fake idea of the American way, the American justice system, the American exceptionalism, when we were just really maybe revealed ourselves to be a divided racist nation but we didn't have to stay there. Now we will be given a choice. Either we're gonna accept that the bear is there and is gonna dominate all of our thinking, or we're going to pull the curtain back or you can't just pull the curtain back because all that does is hide the obvious. But change only happens when you know what you're changing. And I wonder if there's a resolve or an appetite or the courage in this country to make those changes.
Well, I don't know about everybody else, but I certainly know what my appetite is. And
Do you remain hopeful?
I remain hopeful in the resolve of people in this country to not allow their rights to be snuffed out. Even though we're not the best in terms of understanding our history, which can quickly be forgotten, I really do believe that folks do understand what that history is, but they also recognize their present. Black Lives Matter and the allies that were gained by virtue of those nonviolent, peaceful protests and marches this summer were significant in that they were saying, we just want to live in a world that's equal, that doesn't take advantage of us or destroy our bodies and minds. That's it. We're not asking for anything special. Just like Reverend Sharman says, just take your knee off our necks.
Take your knee off my neck. You know, if we go back to 2016, the example, where where black people were almost lulled into not voting. And
In 2016?
in 2016, lulled into not voting. Wouldn't you think that on some level, some people would have said, if don't poke the bear, if that mechanism of suppression is working, we should just keep it that way. But what seemed to have happened is it got exacerbated. It's like, well, wait a minute, you woke up, things were, you were suppressing the vote successfully, but not doing anything. Now you start doing things, and all you really do is wake up a sleeping giant, which got woken up.
You mean us, the sleeping giant?
We didn't even know we were the sleeping giant. I don't think, until something that had already been taken away from us on some level was being taken away from us in a more blatant way.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to be very careful moving forward that we don't get lulled into complacency. Because we can see very clearly, I think, that every gain that we've achieved over the last 200 years can be taken away very quickly and by people who have no interest in seeing a just nation. What would be your message to particularly young people about that history and how vigilant they have to be about these things?
Well, I think a message to young people is for them to recognize that if they believe in and supported any of the marches that happened, if they fundamentally believe that they also may live in a society that doesn't necessarily protect their lives and limb, then they must continue to be active, whether or not it's silent or whether or not it's vocal, to make certain that the rights that they have or the rights that they aspire to, because a lot of people have a vision about the way things should be, and they're not necessarily a part of our reality today. So if they want to live the vision that they have imagined, it doesn't come by sitting back and waiting for somebody else to do it. Certainly not folks like me and you who are looking at them and saying, we need you to go out there and carry the mantle. We need you to go out there and be the leaders, and we will follow you.
One of the things that my son always reminds me of about politics in this country is Democrats have a tendency to be reactionary. They react to the moment, whereas Republicans play for the long game. And when you look at the history of Chief Justice John Roberts and his efforts to overturn the Voting Rights Act, it didn't start in 2013. It had been going on for a long time. And one of the reasons that the vote is so important is someone like Mitch McConnell, whose long game was to stack the courts so that everything could, people like John Roberts could eventually be in a position to overturn the Voting Rights Act. I think there's a certain kind of vigilance that we have to practice, but also, do you think we are, as a group, we are susceptible to the moment? I mean, George Floyd was murdered in front of our eyes, and it kicked off a movement. But as a commercial I heard recently, where a female black basketball coach said she has to tell her players, stay ready so you don't have to get ready. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that you get the sense that we're just waiting for the next dramatic event to happen before we start getting ourselves ready to defend our rights?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I really am not sure. I guess we will see, and it's not going to take very long for us to see that in the next coming year or two. But you said something that a little earlier that I find interesting, because I recall when Barack Obama was first elected president, and I recall folks talking about a post-racial society. You tell me, who came up with that myth
Yeah.
that we are somehow living in a post-racial society? Why? Because a black man happened to be elected president of the United States, when so many of the things that demonstrate to us that we are not in a post-racial society still exist? So I think the recognition that we're not living in a post-racial society, that there are these reactionary things that are happening on the other side, as long as people remain aware and vigilant of that and recognize that there's still a struggle that exists, because I don't know whether or not we will ever live in a post-racial society in this country, simply because that original sin of racism and white supremacy, I don't know whether or not people have that ingrained in their souls and their DNA, or whether or not it's a social construct and the ability to be in a position of power that they simply cannot get rid of, because their fear is that, a theory, that if other folks wind up having that power, like they said in defense of the Arizona suit, that it's a zero-sum game. If you gain, that means that I lose. So for a lot of folks, their belief that if African Americans and Latinos or Hispanics and Native Americans, women gain, that they may necessarily lose. That's the battleground there, is converting that kind of thinking to think that if you give someone else power, then you necessarily don't have any yourself.
Well, Abu, thank you very much for joining us today. You know, me and you could get to talking about these subjects and go on for days and days and days, but we can't do that today. But I would want to echo something what you talked about earlier about not waiting for the dramatic event to spur us to protect ourselves, to protect our rights, and to invest in our own futures. And also understand that when black people turned out to vote this last election, we can give ourselves credit for saving the democracy, because the democracy was teetering. I mean, here was a president who had said if he lost, it was because of voter fraud. But if he won, it wouldn't be because of voter fraud. Well, he invalidated the electoral process. We didn't. We have to find ways to make sure that the electoral process is honored, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. And we can't wait for an incident, a murder to happen in front of our eyes again, or an insurrection at the Capitol to overturn a legitimate vote. We cannot wait for those things to happen again. We have to stay on guard all the time, and that's why it matters. And I applaud the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities for supporting this program, because part of the question they ask is why it matters. Why does it matter? Because democracies will go away, and democracies rarely fall from the outside. We know that now too. History shows us that democracies fail from the inside more than they fall from the outside. And with that being said, as I said before, stay ready so you don't have to get ready. And with that, thank you, and we'll see you at the next event.
Right on.
Bam. What was our time?
25.
Oh, God. We talked for
25?
We talked for 25 minutes?
You talked for 25 minutes.
That ain't nothing.
That is. Let's do another one. What was it Ernie Banks say? Let's play two.
Let's play two.
Out from the great strip city, a train came. Its cargo was pain and steel, determined to crush the will. Out from the great strip city, pain and steel rode the train. While at yesterday, clouds were rolling away and questions were